Stanford University.
Welcome to the first colloquium of the academic year, which is a rather unusual one. We are commemorating the 100th anniversary of Joe Greenberg's birth, appropriately in the Greenberg Room. I am the MC, so I will be very brief, and the other speakers will be relatively brief. Joe was one of the great linguists of the 20th century. He was a polymath, knowledgeable in a wide array of subjects. He's best known for his work on the classification of languages, both typological and genetic. And he had a huge influence in both of these fields, both substantively and methodologically. He was also one of the founders of the linguistics department at Stanford. He played a key role in decision, even though he was 100% time in anthropology, Joe played a key role in the establishment of the department and in sort of early directions that it took. Personally, one of my great regrets in my 40-plus years here at Stanford is that I never sat in on a course of Joe's. This was partly because I came here almost directly from MIT, and at that time, the work that Joe was doing was tended to be dismissed as not very important by my teachers, and by the time I had learned that they were wrong and how deep Joe's work was, he was no longer teaching. I do have one favorite Joe Greenberg anecdote, which I will tell. I was chatting with him after a talk that he gave about his work on the genetic classification of the languages of the Americas, work that then and now is very controversial. And he said, well, I just don't understand why it's so controversial. Once you look at data from 200 or 300 languages, it just jumps out at you as though that were a trivial thing. Fortunately, the four speakers we have today were wiser than I was and got to know Joe and much better than I did, very well. Each of them will briefly, 7 to 10 minutes, share some remembrances, and then we'll open things up to discussion. So we're going to go in chronological order, and some of you, the current graduate students, may not know some of these people because some are emeriti. One is from a neighboring department. But the first speaker is Elizabeth Traugott, emeritus professor in the department.
Well, thank you. We've been asked to talk about two things. One is Joe Greenberg's contribution to linguistics and to the department, and the other is some more personal things, so that we have a sense of, how this department came into being and who was involved in the early years. I came here in 1968, and I had been teaching in Tanzania. So when I came, my first connection with Joe Greenberg was really on African languages, because he was a major contributor to the classification of African languages. And that was our first contact point. But he and Charles Ferguson, who was mentioned, were the PIs on a project on universals of human language. And I got involved with that, and I know Eve Clark is going to talk a lot more about that because she was more involved than I was. But to me, remembering Joe back in 1968, which was quite a while ago, it was a recollection of the force and the excitement around the Universals project. Now, if you think about 1968, for those of you who were not around in 1968, it was a very, very intense time. It was a time of huge demoralization over the Vietnam War. But the department was not demoralized at all. It was hugely energized. by this Universals project and by the debate that was ongoing at the time, which Tom alluded to, the debate about what universals are all about. There was a relatively young man called Noam Chomsky, who was a political activist and who was thinking about universals in the brain and the mind and focusing on cognition. And there was Joe Greenberg, who, as was mentioned, studied 300 plus languages and did field work on them, by the way. He did field work on them, who was focused on data and drawing generalizations out of the data. Now, as history has gone down for many decades since then, more and more interest has revived in the generalizations that he drew from all these many languages. Probably best known to all of you are the universals on word order, the differences between OV languages and VO languages. I mean, it's a point that's so well known, it's sort of part of, I'm sure, any Ling 1, that there are correlations between object-verb languages and verb-object languages. For example, auxiliaries in verb-object languages go at the end. I'm sorry, I got it reversed. In object-verb languages, auxiliaries go at the end. And in I'm having a little trouble with this. Verb-object languages, they go at the end, and object-verb languages, they go before the verb. This is very well known. And it was Joe who basically established the correlations between the morphosyntax of object-verb languages and the morphosyntax of verb-object languages. Now, what you may not be so aware of, because I'm sure everybody knows that very well, is in the history of English, there was a change. There was a change from object-verb to verb-object around the year 1300. And so the history of English actually shows very nicely the differences between the two language types. And the thing that to me was really important about Joe Greenberg's work was that he looked at the typology of languages, not only synchronically, but also diachronically, because I'm a historical linguist. And so I've always been interested in the typologies of language change. I'll give you one example that became really very, very influential in work on grammaticalization, which was how demonstratives develop. So most languages have demonstratives. We have that. Latin had ille. That is the historical origin of the article the in English. So what Joe Greenberg did was he presented a typology of change that languages would tend, they didn't have to, because this wasn't an absolute universal, this is a tendency. A tendency in languages, if you happen to have a demonstrative, it is likely to turn into an article. It doesn't have to. It's likely to turn into an article, so that turned into the. Now, those articles may come to mark particular phenomena, so they make a distinction between the Mississippi and Mississippi, and going to the store as opposed to, not, well, going to the school, going to the university as opposed to going to university. So you make a distinction between the particular and the general. And over time, in some languages, the original demonstratives that have become articles actually become gender markers. So if you think of any of the Romance languages, think of French, le and la. They come from Latin ille. So you have to mark any noun by something that has either feminine or masculine. Nothing to do with real gender, but linguistic abstract gender. So his typology of languages was, you can check historically, does a language show this particular trajectory? This became extraordinarily important in work on grammaticalization because it was an example of some contentful, relatively free, relatively lexical item turning into something fixed, obligatory in the last stage. And he showed this in various languages, not just European languages, but Armenian is that second stage, which has things like Mississippi and the Mississippi. And then in 1991, he wrote an article that showed how this worked in Chibchan, which is a language of Bolivia, and in Algonquian. So in various languages of the world. So I think that the work is really important for typology now and also for historical linguistics. On a more personal note, I'll just say a couple of things. He was a man of great routine. I think those of us who were around at the time will remember that every day he walked across the quad to the faculty club to meet with his wife and have lunch. And he went to the library pretty much every day, and there were all these atlases of the world and grammars, and he had a table which was covered in all these things. Didn't put them away. And a plaque was put in the library to commemorate his place there and the research that he did in the library. But I think the really important thing for us is that nowadays, though Tom mentioned the fact that back in the early 70s, a lot of the work was dismissed because it was focused on data, it was not focused on the neuroscience and the brain and the mind. It was not top-down, it was very much bottom-up work. But today, people are very, very interested in micro facts and micro parameters and micro this is and micro that's in linguistics. And a great deal of work is being done now. In typology, I'm thinking of the kind of work that Bill Croft, who is a student here, is doing, and Haspelmath and the big World Atlas of the Languages. They're totally dependent on the original work that Joe Greenberg did. So, as many things, it's come full cycle back to remembering him, not only for the centennial, but also very much in the work that we do these days. So I think my 7 minutes or so is up, and I'll pass on to Eve.
I will perhaps take a slightly more personal approach to talking about Joe Greenberg. I remember him very vividly, and for both personal and professional reasons. First of all, Joe gave me my first job in linguistics. That was an important point. Herb had been offered a job in psychology at Stanford, wasn't sure whether he would take it or not. We were based in Pittsburgh in western Pennsylvania. And I had been teaching French there while I wrote my dissertation, and also finding out that there were simply no linguistics departments in western Pennsylvania. So clearly we wanted to move somewhere. And we flew out to California, it was when I first met Elizabeth, to see what the possibilities might be for us both. And I talked to Joe Greenberg, and he offered me a position as research associate on the Universals project. Without my having done anything on universals, without my knowing anything about language typology. And I think the thing that sold it to him was that I was doing my dissertation with John Lyons. And so that was probably a help, I think. And this was actually a real lifeline, and it clinched our decision to move west. When we moved 6 months later, I began reading a lot, including Joe's 63 book on universals of language, which ended up being absolutely critical for a lot of the work on language processing in the 1970s and 1980s. And I also spent a lot of time looking at his monograph from 1966, where on language universals with special reference to feature hierarchies, where he discussed all sorts of different kinds of markedness in language. So why the singular is unmarked compared to the plural, why some pronouns are unmarked with respect to others, why present tense forms are unmarked with respect to non-present, and so on. There are many, many of these. And I became particularly interested in the arguments that he made in this book. And partly because it suggested to me that you could actually look at this in terms of what difference does this make to people using language or to children acquiring language? Do they acquire unmarked forms before marked ones? I thought that this would be an interesting domain to look at. But in the meantime, I was working on the Universals project on what was actually a really interesting project to me, and that was the relation between existential, locative, and possessive constructions. And so, Joe was always encouraging me to look at new languages, and we worked, all of us, using the available grammars, but also where we could, we would use informants on campus. And there were a lot of non-English speakers around on campus, so I used informants whenever I could. And the problem was that I kept on finding that there were major mismatches between what was in the grammars and what informants told me. And so I would have many discussions with Joe about how you reconciled the data in these cases. He sort of said, well, often you only have a grammar to depend on, but if you have informants, you have to find out much more about them to find out whether, in fact, they are using the same variety that the grammar was written for, and then you have to decide which you're going to take. So anyway, we went a little bit round and round on what to do in these sorts of cases. But one day when we were having this discussion, Joe at a certain point said, well, is there something you would rather do? And so I said, yes, what if I tried to look instead at children and look at some of these markedness relations? So I did finish this project on existential, locative, and possessive constructions. But once I had finished it, what I did was start thinking about what kinds of questions you could ask in acquisition to look at whether markedness was playing a role in acquisition. So I thought, let me sketch very briefly one of the studies that we did. If you look at dimensional terms in languages, what you have is usually two ends of some sort of continuum, like big, small, high, low, long, short. And one of the terms typically can be used in neutral questions about the dimension. So how high is it? It's 1 meter high. This term also provides the name of the dimension. So from high, you get height. These were all properties of these dimensional terms that were pointed out originally by Sapir, I think in his 44 paper. But I thought it would be interesting to see whether there is some sort of conceptual basis to this. So suppose we take various kinds of materials that vary on those dimensions, so a set of 5 strips of different lengths for talking about lengths, or 5 little doors drawn with door handles and hinges for asking about height and so on, and teach children using nonsense words a term for the extended dimension versus relative lack of extension against some standard. Well, we always would pick out one of these items as a standard when we were doing this teaching. What we were predicting was that if these asymmetries in the languages are based on a conceptual asymmetry for thinking about measurement, where you go from a 0 point to some extension, but when you talk about lack of extension, you're going back from some standard down towards the 0 point again. So, he's 6 feet tall versus he's only 5 feet tall, or he's a foot shorter than X. Then you've got this relative lack of extension. So we taught 3-, 4-, and 5-year-olds nonsense words for each end of the dimensions of size, height, length, and thickness. And actually, that's the second one, I think. That's right. And if you look at the lines on this graph, The first line just shows the number of trials. The first panel is the number of trials that children took to learn these nonsense terms, and the black dots are the positive terms, and the white open circles are the negative terms. So they always took fewer trials to learn the positive terms than the negative ones. This was absolutely consistent over age. And we also looked to see how many errors they made in the course of learning. And again, they made many fewer errors on the positive terms than the negative ones, which you would predict from markedness. We then did a little checking to see what happens if we test them on the English terms for these dimensions. You know, some of them they might know, some not. And here, what we have is a comparison. The solid lines are the learning task. So these are the positive nonsense terms. These are the negative ones for each of the dimensions. And the dotted lines are the actual English terms. So they knew the words for size, height, length, and they didn't really know thickness at all. And so they clearly were not translating. These are quite separate. These two sets of lines on the graph significantly different from each other. So this is the kind of study that we started doing. We also did a number of other explorations of markedness. I looked at temporal conjunctions, various spatial prepositional and adjectival pairs, kinship terms, deictic verbs, and also their uses in the language for entry into versus departure from some sort of notion of normal state. There I was drawing a lot on Fillmore's work as well. The use of the negative un to prefix verbs for actions, and at number, where the singular is unmarked compared to the plural. And this children grasp extremely early. And they want to mark something that is more than one, but they don't necessarily learn the plural ending first. So we found there was sort of some interesting options where children will sometimes pick a numeral to mark plural. So anything that's plural is 2. So you can count frogs on a page and, you know, get the kid to count up to 6 and then say, how many frogs are there? 2. It is a very stable finding. So this was where I sort of departed, in a sense, from the direct work on language universals in terms of typologies of word order. But it seems to me that the work on markedness and the semantics of what goes on in the lexicon of a language is also extremely important when we think about how people might be building on any sort of conceptual basis. And this was something that Joe was extremely interested in and argued for as being the ultimate explanation, not only for stuff in the lexicon, but also for some of the word order stuff, because he said what you need to do is know what you can predict about a language. If you know it's an OV language, you can have all sorts of expectations about where other structural units are going to appear relative to the verb or to the noun. So he was extremely interested in this sort of approach and always actually kept a very, I don't know how much he read, but he read quite a bit in the psycholinguistics literature just to sort of keep track of what were people claiming about processing, how did it relate to the sort of claims that he was making. So I've always been extremely indebted to Joe. First, I learned an enormous amount about typology from him, even though I didn't go on in that domain. I also learned from colleagues on the Universals project, particularly Larry Horn, who had a great deal of interest in the semantics of the lexicon as well, and Edith Moravchik, who was interested in everything to do with universals. Second, Joe, for me, always represented the sort of model of a scholar in linguistics. He was fascinated by every aspect of language. And he was a real well of information on whatever topic you brought up, from what it meant to have perfect pitch, which he had. He was a pianist. Early on, I will speed up a little bit. He actually could have played professionally, I think. From translating terms like train into a variety of West African languages. This was during the Second World War. To what it was like to grow up in Brooklyn in a Jewish family in the middle of an Italian neighborhood, where, why he taught himself Latin and Greek, at high school age, why he read so many grammars of exotic languages before he ever went anywhere near university. These were actually all connected and had a lot to do with avoiding getting beaten up on his way back from school. He was fond of anecdotes, actually, on this. And one day, I'll give you one last... and I went to talk to him in his office to find out whether there were any languages that favored a pattern of using final nasals followed by a homorganic stop. But where this language didn't have voiced final stops. And Joe immediately went to one of his bookshelves and said, I think there's something in this, and pulled down a grammar. I don't remember what language it was anymore. And indeed, it was a language that had no voiced final stops, but did have nasals plus voiceless homorganic stops in final position. And I was extremely interested in this because I was looking at data from children who used this as a strategy for producing final voice stops. So instead of saying frog, they would say fronk. They couldn't pronounce the final G. They could do a nasal plus a K. What so impressed me was that Joe could remember such a small detail about one of the many languages he had studied, and he also knew exactly on which shelf to find the relevant grammar. This, I thought, was quite a feat, absolutely typical of Joe. So, you know, my final point I'm most grateful for and remember him for is that he encouraged me to take up my interest in first language acquisition, and so he set me on my professional path.
I will introduce Will Leben, another emeritus professor in our department, and as I said, the primary moving force behind this event.
Well, Eve just told us about Greenberg, the psycholinguist. That is not the first thing that we associate him with, but in doing a little research for today, I found that in 1951, when he was 36 years old, I guess, as a member of the Social Science Research Council, he was one of the movers behind the formation of a new committee on linguistics and psychology. And the mandate of this committee, I'll read, was to foster work in these new fields, including mother tongue acquisition, language structure and thought, the role of dialect in social class, and the study of linguistic structure using psychological methods. And that just shows what vision he had. At the time, he was a professor at Columbia University. 11 years later, Stanford hired him away from Columbia. That was in 1962. And the idea, I think, at the time was Stanford wanted to build the humanities and social sciences here. And when Greenberg came, he set about doing that. So we've already heard about his role in starting the Universals Project, his key role in putting together a committee on linguistics. This was a committee of faculty who were already at Stanford. We didn't have a linguistics department, but we had faculty who were in philosophy or in the different language departments who were interested in linguistics and, in many cases, practicing linguists. But once Greenberg came, what happened is that a set of new hires came about that formed a new linguistics department. And I think all of us on the panel, in some way or another, quite directly, our being here is a result of early moves by Joe Greenberg to form a linguistics department. So we all owe a lot to him. Greenberg made his first splash in work on Africa. His dissertation was based on field work that he did in northern Nigeria among a group of Hausa called the Maguzawa. And it was anthropological and linguistic study. later on, I came to work in the same area of northern Nigeria, also among the Hausa, and occasionally Joe, who was kind of a shy person, occasionally he would greet me in Hausa. Eve mentioned his Brooklyn origin, with a slight Hausa, Brooklyn accent. Ina gajiya, ina kwana. Okay, and his house had maybe a slight Brooklyn tinge. His English was totally Brooklyn. But the magic of Joe Greenberg was he made Brooklynese sound erudite. From his PhD work, he noticed that the field of African language classification was a total mess. There were lots of competing views, a lot of confusion, and even in areas where there was agreement, Greenberg found that the agreement really wasn't based on anything substantial. And so Greenberg came into the field of African language classification to try to put the classification in some order. And he did. He wound up with the classification. It created a huge controversy at the time, but he classified the languages of Africa into 4 families. There was Afroasiatic, that included Semitic, ancient Egyptian, Berber, Chadic, which includes Hausa, and maybe 1 or 2 others. It included Nilo-Saharan. The second family was Nilo-Saharan, that contained the Nilotic languages, including Luo, which is the language that the father of President Obama speaks. The third family was Niger-Congo, which the largest family by far, over 1,500 languages in the group, that encompasses most of Central Africa and large parts of West Africa, East Africa, and all of Southern Africa. And then finally, a small group called Khoisan that is probably not one family. It's the Click languages that go way back. There are probably 24 of them, many of them endangered. And further research has found that probably the Khoisan are 3 or more separate families. At any rate, Greenberg established these 4 families, and this made a lot of people mad because you notice in that list of 4 was not included Bantu, which was this significant group. Bantu languages covered just the heart of Africa, Central Africa, large parts of East Africa, and all of Southern Africa. 500 languages. Where is Bantu among the families? And Greenberg, by using his method of mass comparison, comparing lexical items across languages, comparing derivational and inflectional morphemes, and very little else, he showed that the Bantu languages were very closely related to sets of neighboring languages. And so from Bantu, he incorporated it into a group called Bantoid. And then Bantoid languages, in turn, were part of a larger group, which was Benue-Congo. And Benue-Congo was, in turn, a member, along with other languages, of the Niger-Congo family. So scholars at the time criticized Greenberg's conclusions and his methods. And but due to 2 things. First of all, his command of the facts, which others have already commented on, and his ability to see things clearly, to dispassionately look at things and just logically deduce. This doesn't make sense, this does make sense. He was able to change the prevailing viewpoint so that after 10 years of controversy, by the time 1963 is the date of the publication of his Languages of Africa volume, by that time, the controversy was already starting to wane, and Greenberg prevailed, which was very nice. But it may be that the fact that he won out in that debate caused him to stick with his method of mass comparison in cases in the future where his work has come under fire in other world areas, for example, the languages of the Americas and the Nostratic hypothesis. But to me, whether mass comparison is right or not, there's a couple of points, two important points. First of all, with African language classification, his first work on classification in Africa was published in 1955. In 1955, we had very, very rudimentary knowledge of the languages that he was dealing with. All we mostly had, for most languages, was word lists of a few hundred words. The word lists were not compiled by native speakers. This was during the colonial era. Native speakers weren't linguists. The linguists were foreigners. They were missionaries. They were colonial officers who were looking for an interesting way to pass the time, and so they'd kind of make word lists of the languages and so on. But using that limited data, he came to conclusions that still hold up today. That's the first point. Second point about Greenberg's methodology, as Larry Hyman has recently noted, Greenberg was not against the comparative method or against linguistic reconstruction. If you look at the reading list that Elizabeth prepared on the back side, there are a couple articles. He reconstructed the tone system of Proto-Bantu. He wrote an article in Word in 1958 on the labial consonants of Proto-Afroasiatic. What he said in his classes here at Stanford about the issue of methodology and language classification is that if you want to do the comparative method, you have to have some preliminary groupings. And how are you going to group languages except by comparing cognates across them? That was his justification. Another case where, a final case, where Greenberg made a contribution to the study of African languages is using linguistic evidence to trace the history of different peoples. And you'll see in the list a couple that I won't take the time to mention. So in closing, if like Tom, you didn't have a chance to sit in on Greenberg's classes or to talk with him about this or that, fortunately, he's left this enormous body of work, some of which Elizabeth has taken the trouble to list for you here. And I encourage you all sometime during his centennial year to go back and read some of it.
Thank you. Well, and now our next speaker is Jim Fox from the Department of Anthropology. Many of you don't know him, but you should. Jim worked very closely with Joe.
Well, I came to Stanford in 1974. Please excuse my shaking hand. I have Parkinson's disease. It's a mild case so far. Bothers you more than me. When I came to Stanford, Joe assigned me to an office near his. I owe my job to him too, probably almost as much as Eve, except that I think they must have had a vote. But at any rate, I got the job, and I ended up in an office in building 110 in the second floor on the other end of the hall from where Joe was. And we would see each other often. He would always coming into my office and wanting to talk about this or that. I often saw him in the library, too. He haunted the second floor of Green Library, as has been said. And I took the opportunity to take classes from Joe. He taught the history of anthropological theory, and I audited that class twice from him. By auditing, I mean I sat in on the lectures and didn't do the readings. Another class I audited twice from him was his Universals of Human Language class. I just loved hearing him speak. I loved the logic of what he said and his historical background. The history of anthropology theory went all the way back to Herodotus. We still teach it, but we don't go back to Herodotus. We're lucky if we make it into the 19th century. But he did, and he brought it all into sharp focus for us. I had gotten to know Joe's work before I came to Stanford as a graduate student, and I was fortunate that my professors all thought his work was great and assigned it and required me to understand it. His early work on language universals, which some disparaged as surface structure universals, was important to me because I was working at that time on pidgin languages, and it had been claimed that pidgin languages didn't obey the universals that Joe had proposed. And I was able to show in my master's thesis that they did, and that people who thought they didn't were wrong, usually because they didn't keep track of who was speaking in a given thing that was quoted from a pidgin language. But the work that came to be more important to me was the work on classification, because he had had this fantastic success with his African classification. He had already advanced, an American Indian language classification, which was only a few pages long, had no data whatsoever in it, but it had the results of his lexical inspection of a mass comparison of a large number of languages. And you either bought it or you didn't, but there was no data. He then came out with an article on the data in Current Anthropology, and he co-wrote that with a dentist, a dental anthropologist, and a physical anthropologist, and tried to show how the linguistic, dental, and other physical evidence correlated well for a history of the entry into the Americas of 3 different major language groups and their subsequent spread through the Americas. That theory was widely rejected in the linguistics of our day, and the work on American language was characterized by what Greenberg used to call stock specialists. Now, there was a special bad place in his vocabulary for stock specialists. These are people who are specialized in the languages of one stock or maybe 2, but who don't know anything about the other stocks and don't have this overall view that he had. So the stock specialists in Mayan, for example, rejected his work. The stock specialists in Uto-Aztecan, similarly. There weren't specialists for every stock in the Americas, but the ones for which we had specialists tended to reject that stuff. I came on the scene being a stock specialist in Mayan. I don't know how I ever passed his scrutiny to come into the department, because I came in as a stock specialist. And since then, I've really only added 1 stock to my store. I also work on the Mixe-Soquean languages of southern Mexico, gradually trying to build up a knowledge of all those languages, which the total of the 2 stocks would now be roughly 45 or 50 languages. And Joe is talking about hundreds. I'm talking about Mayan being related to Mixe-Soquean, which for him is such a shallow relationship that it's almost incomprehensible that anyone would even specialize in it. It's way below his level of look. But we had a conference on this in the 1990s, and the major stock specialists on Mayan were Terence Kaufman and Lyle Campbell. And Lyle Campbell publicly agreed with some evidence that I gave that the classification that Joe gave was right in one little instance. So that was the first move I ever became aware of, that things were starting to turn his way with the American classification. It's still a long way from being accomplished, but some of the old stock specialists are dying. And I think that's the way things really move, you know. I want to show you an example of some data that Joe gave for the relatedness of certain languages in a vast phylum of languages that he called Penutian. adding to the old Penutian category of Sapir and others, the languages of Mexico. I got up here some supposed cognates, and I want to show you that his method bore within it some certain weaknesses that he knew were there, and others would point out, but also had some strengths that are very important to me. These are numbered cognates in his list of cognate sets for the Penutian languages. This is number 220, a cognate which he reconstructs as sky sub 2. And he finds that in Tunica, which is an extinct language of northern Louisiana, called in the Wikipedia an isolate, most of them are still called that. So you can see that just from that, his classification has not really taken hold quite. He gives an example from Tunica as a word aparu, meaning heaven or cloud, which he reconstructs as the ancient meaning of sky. And the only cognate he finds for that is in a Mayan language, which I happen to know well, Cachiquel. And there we have a word paruwi, which means above. So aparu and paruwi look sort of similar, and their meanings are sort of similar, and he called them cognates, and evidence for his inclusion of Mayan in the Penutian language family, as well as Tunica. The problem with that is that we now know that that form that he cited from Cachiquel is really a phrase, pa-ruit, on its top, on its tip. And so it's morphologically complex, which he did not recognize in looking at it, because he wasn't a stock specialist. He was liable to pick up errors like this because he didn't know the languages that he was looking at as well as a stock specialist would. But he knew other languages a stock specialist would not know. So we now know that those two cognates are not cognates, and that's a wrong example. The second one I give is wasp, reconstructed as meaning wasp from Central Sierra Miwok, which is a known Penutian language of California. The word shushu for honeybee or bee. He correlates with Tseltal Mayan, shush, wasp. And the problem is that they're sound symbolic words, and therefore they don't weigh as much, if you're going to count them at all, in the proving of a linguistic relationship. I was telling some students the other day that if you're looking, we're not very many people in the world, I think, that have a word they say when you sneeze. In English we do. We say hachu. Not everybody does it. I asked my class, none of them say hachu. But it's something we used to do. But in a language I've been looking at in southern Mexico, there's a word for sneeze, not what you say when you sneeze, but the word for sneeze, hatzim. And that's similar enough to hachu, to where somebody like Joe probably would have called them cognates. But clearly sound symbolic in a very strong way. So those are weak points. The mass comparison method with its lexical inspection is vulnerable to this kind of error. The error attributable to somebody who doesn't know the details of the stock. But its strength is that it looks at other stocks and finds things that stock specialists might never see. And my last example is of that. The true classification of languages always leads stock specialists deeper. Once you know that the languages are related, you then begin comparing them with a more insight into the possibility that they are related and that we're going to find cognates. And here's one that Joe gave, number 263. The word for uncle he reconstructs from Chirimacha, another language isolate from around Louisiana. Word kan, meaning paternal uncle. And comparing that to the Quiche language, which I speak, and which I have taught on occasion at Stanford, they say ikan, which means mother's brother. Wikan would be my mother's brother, Rikan would be his mother's brother, etc. These two words, I think, are cognate. And they're cognate in a most interesting way, in that the Maya form begins with the vowel E, which I think is a fossilized form of the ancient Penutian and general Amerind ergative third person possessive pronoun, E, which Joe claimed was a marker of the general Amerind language phylum. And this shows how you can get back to that by finding that there are fossilized forms that include the old personal pronoun, which now have changed personal pronouns. And so This is one of the, I found a whole series of kinship terms beginning with E that are cognate with Mayan, in Mayan, between Mayan and Mihe-Sokean. In Mihe-Sokean, they are simply third-person pronouns plus a root. And in Mayan, they are just a root. They've been totally fossilized. But they preserve evidence that there used to be such a pronoun. And that's the kind of way it leads deeper. There's other ways. I've found many cognates between Mayan and Mihe-Sokean that show that Mihe-Sokean, these two languages are different typologically, of course, and in some ways very different. Mayan has a whole series of glottalized consonants, etc. And Mihe-Sokean doesn't have them. And so if the languages are related, you have two typologically distinct languages that are related, or here are two families that are related, you can probably reconstruct an ancient form that gives you insight into the origin of this typological distinction. And so I've written an article about the origin of glottalized consonants in Mayan, trying to show how they come from a process that when I described it to Joe, he says, oh yeah, that's the only way it could happen. Which is that you get a word that has a glottal stop in it, like that, between O and O, O-O. And what happens is that the language then starts moving that glottal stop through the word, usually leftward, sometimes rightward if there's no way to go leftward, until it comes to an adjacent obstruent and then coalesces with it and it becomes a glottal stop, a glottalized consonant. And I was able to show that that happened and why it happened in a certain direction. And he said, well, that's not surprising. That's what I would expect. And pointed to me an article by Sapir that basically said the same thing. So that was Joe. It was wonderful to be around. And always instructive, always humiliating. Humbling, I meant. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And now we have this portable microphone so that people can ask questions or share remembrances or criticize what we've said up here.
I guess I'll go with the memory about this, the memory and then the question, which was, you know, when I came here in 1980, right? Elizabeth would know since she was a primary person and had a search committee or whatever. I used to go to Toastmasters meetings, once a week in the morning, and I came from one of those meetings. There's a lot of business people there learning to speak, and I came with a three-piece suit, to campus. And Joe looked at me and he held the lapel and he said, that's not a very good idea for getting tenure here. And of course, and those, as an assistant professor, you're very nervous. Anybody says anything, like wear sandals instead of shoes, you do it. And so even though I was very proud of my three-piece suit at the meeting, I kind of went home and don't think I ever wore it again coming to the department. My question was about Ferguson, because when you were talking, Eve, I was wondering, it would have been nice to have him here, of course. I was wondering whether his work on, child language, I guess especially phonology, whether he was led into it through his interest and work on universals, because he worked on both kinds of projects. Yes.
As far as I know, his work on acquisition didn't stem from the Universals project per se. He had done, he was doing a lot of sociolinguistic work in North Africa, and it was partly from that he got interested in the fact that there were particular words that that adults used in talking to very small children, and he wrote this paper, I think in the middle 50s, 56 or so, on baby talk in 6 languages. And he then got interested, I think, in some of the phonological questions, and he actually had a separate project, which Marilyn Wiechmann worked on and Marcy Macken, looking at children's acquisition of phonology. But as far as I know, it was not tied into the Universals project.
Thank you again.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.